Tonight, we step softly into a world shaped by the quiet shadows of empire, where the humid air carries the weight of stories untold and the faint, persistent hope of change. You find yourself walking along the dusty paths of Dahomey, known today as Benin, during the early days of French colonial rule, a time when the land was stitched tightly under foreign control. The colonial chains are heavy, a palpable presence that coils around towns and villages, squeezing economic and cultural life into narrow confines. The French flag flaps arrogantly above administrative buildings, while the locals trudge beneath its shadow, carrying burdens they did not choose. Yet beneath the surface there is a murmur, a collective breath held in anticipation. You can almost hear it in the chatter at markets, in the clink of pottery, and in the rustling of palm leaves, a whisper of cultural pride and resistance, subtle but persistent. It's a world where the dance of power is masked in politeness and paperwork, but where small acts of resilience ripple through communities like quiet waves. Colonial administrators, believing themselves invincible, impose taxes and laws that seem to tighten the grip daily, but the Dahomeyans are no strangers to struggle. Historians still argue whether the earliest resistances were spontaneous rebellions or deeply rooted strategic responses crafted by local leaders. What is certain is that life under French rule was layered with contradictions, forced assimilation on one hand, and the stubborn preservation of local languages, religions, and customs on the other. Interestingly, the French often underestimated the power of cultural identity, thinking that political control meant complete domination. Meanwhile, the people found ways to embed their resistance in daily life even as they outwardly complied. For example, despite official bans on traditional dress, in some towns many women quietly wore them under their French-style clothing, a kind of sartorial protest not found in any government memo. And if you're wondering, yes, the French did try to make their colonial offices smell more civilized, reportedly using crocodile dung as a kind of rustic deodorizer in some remote posts. Whether that was an attempt at local flavor or just a desperate masking of the tropical musk, it certainly did not impress the locals who found the practice, let's say, less than fragrant. This strange detail reminds you that even the colonialists were often ill-prepared for the realities of their new homes, caught between arrogance and adaptation. All right, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. You slip deeper into the lush forests and vibrant villages where the ancestors' spirits whisper among the trees, and the heartbeat of Vodun Benin's ancient spiritual tradition thrums beneath the surface of everyday life. Here, resistance is not only political but profoundly spiritual, woven through sacred rituals, masked ceremonies, and the quiet calling of the divine. The people find strength in the invisible threads connecting them to their ancestors, and these bonds become an unseen fortress against colonial oppression. Vodun priests and priestesses, often dismissed by French officials as mere superstition, in fact, hold immense sway guiding communities through rites that honor the land and the past, while also inspiring courage for the present struggle. You almost sense the flicker of torches in moonlit groves, the rhythmic pounding of drums vibrating through the soil, telling stories older than the colonial maps that tried to erase them. Historians still argue whether Vodun's role in resistance was primarily spiritual, or if it also served as a coded political network, but it's clear that its rituals created a shared identity that colonial rule could not dismantle. What's fascinating and often overlooked is that during times of heightened oppression, sacred ceremonies subtly morphed into clandestine meetings where plans for nonviolent resistance were whispered, protected by the sanctity of tradition. Imagine, if you will, elders and youth gathered under a canopy of leaves, discussing strategies while the songs and dances disguise their true intent. These gatherings were powerful acts of defiance, a way to nurture hope and solidarity without raising the suspicion of the colonial authorities. On the quirkier side, some Vodun practitioners famously used palm wine as a symbolic bridge between the living and the spirits, but also, quite practically, to lubricate social ties and ease negotiations within and between villages, almost like an ancient diplomatic lubricant. It's a charming reminder that resistance isn't always solemn. Sometimes it's lively, messy, and human. And while the French often saw Vodun as backward, they never quite grasped how it kept the soul of Dahomey fiercely alive. So, as you listen to the distant drums fading into the night, remember that this spiritual resilience was as much a shield as any protest sign, a whispered promise that freedom was not just political, but deeply rooted in the heart. You find yourself walking quietly among the fields and villages where the real power of resistance often lies not in grand speeches or battles, but in the small, steady acts of refusal, the silent sabotage and everyday defiance that chip away at colonial control. Here, beneath the canopy of towering palms and the shade of baobab trees, ordinary people weave a tapestry of subtle rebellion. The tax collectors' calls are met with evasions. The demands for labor are slowed down by purposeful delays. This is a dance of patience and persistence where a village might collectively refuse to pay a tax or intentionally drag their feet on road construction, transforming routine compliance into a form of protest. You almost hear the soft murmurs behind closed doors, the shared smiles when a plan to outwit colonial officials succeeds again. This quiet storm unsettles the French more than open revolts because it's harder to pinpoint, harder to crush. Historians still argue whether these acts were spontaneous or coordinated by underground networks, but what's clear is that this form of resistance was widespread and deeply embedded in daily life. Even women, often sidelined in historical accounts, played a crucial role, using their social positions and market networks to spread messages and organize boycotts. One striking example is the tax boycotts, where entire communities would simply refuse to pay the levies that funded the colonial regime. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were strategic strikes that targeted the economic lifeblood of colonialism. And as you imagine these scenes, picture the quiet tension in marketplaces and homes where every glance might hold a secret code, every whispered word a plan for the next subtle strike. On a more peculiar note, there's an often overlooked story of how villagers used cassava leaves not just for food, but as a natural ink to write secret messages disguised as grocery lists. It's a tiny detail that hints at the cleverness and resourcefulness of those resisting turning everyday objects into tools of rebellion. Meanwhile, the French, focused on brute force and bureaucratic control, frequently missed these low-key operations that thrived in the shadows. It's a reminder that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet whisper that echoes through generations. You drift now into the vibrant world of words, ideas, and ink-stained fingers, where the pen becomes mightier than any sword, or at least just as sharp if you believe the determined intellectuals of Dahomey. Teachers, traders, and budding journalists begin to form the backbone of a resistance that takes shape not in gunfire but in speeches, essays, and newsletters carefully printed and passed hand to hand. In dusty classrooms and cramped meeting rooms, they nurture a new kind of rebellion, one built on education and cultural pride. You might imagine a group of young men and women hunched over worn paper, crafting petitions to colonial officials demanding rights, or debating heatedly about the future of their land and people. Their words seek to pierce through the colonial veneer, awakening a collective consciousness that can no longer accept subjugation in silence. Historians still argue whether these early intellectual movements had more influence locally or internationally, but there's no denying their power in shaping a new identity. The establishment of cultural societies and newspapers written in local languages challenged the French narrative and offered a platform for expressing dissent. Intriguingly, some of these intellectuals were multilingual, navigating French and indigenous languages with ease, weaving together a message that resonated across divides. And while the French tried to censor and control these publications, the ideas found ways to slip through, carried by travelers, traders, and eager readers hungry for change. You can almost feel the electric buzz of these secret exchanges, like the crackle of a radio signal trying to break through static. Here's a curious tidbit. One early newspaper editor was rumored to have used a typewriter that was once owned by a French official who had a penchant for cryptic jokes. Some say he deliberately left it behind, hoping his subversive humor would live on. Whether that's true or just a delightful myth, it speaks to how resistance often wore a cloak of wit and irony, mocking the very authority it challenged. So as you imagine the swirl of ink and ideas filling the air, remember that sometimes the loudest revolutions begin softly in the quiet clatter of keys and the scratch of pens. You now find yourself immersed in a landscape where music and storytelling become as vital to resistance as any petition or march. The rhythms of drums echo across villages and towns, carrying messages both ancient and urgent. Songs laced with clever metaphors and sly humor spread like wildfire, uniting communities across ethnic and social divides. In marketplaces, around fires, and beneath the vast African sky, griots and singers become unofficial spokespeople for a peaceful rebellion. Their voices rise and fall, sometimes gentle lullabies soothing tired souls, other times sharp calls to awaken dignity and pride. These songs serve as both balm and battle cry, and you can almost feel the vibrations against your skin, a tangible pulse of shared hope and quiet defiance. Historians still debate whether the influence of these musical movements was purely cultural, or if they directly galvanized political action, but there's no denying their profound emotional power. What's charming is how these songs often employed humor to undermine colonial authority, poking fun at French officials and their awkward attempts at control without ever resorting to violence. Imagine a cheeky song about a clumsy colonial officer tripping over his own paperwork, delivered with a wink and a smile, music as both entertainment and resistance. Storytellers too wield this power through allegory, weaving tales of clever animals outwitting stronger foes, thinly veiled parables of the colonial situation. On a delightful note, some performers incorporated unexpected instruments like hollowed gourds filled with pebbles or even repurposed bicycle spokes, adding a unique Beninese twist to their sound. It's a reminder that creativity often blooms brightest in adversity, turning the simplest materials into tools of cultural resilience. So as the melodies fade into the evening air, you realize that these songs weren't just entertainment. They were subtle, sonic acts of rebellion, stitching communities together in harmony and hope, one note at a time. You wander through bustling markets and sun-drenched streets, where the pulse of resistance quickens and becomes unmistakably visible. Here, the power of economic boycotts intertwines with peaceful marches, creating a tapestry of organized defiance that stretches across towns and cities. Vendors quietly refuse to sell colonial goods, shoppers avoid French products, and the ripple effect is felt all the way up the chain, hitting the economic interests that keep the colonial machine humming. These markets, so often the lifeblood of daily life, transform into arenas of protest where choices about what to buy and sell become acts of political significance. You can almost smell the fresh produce, mingling with the simmering tension of change. Feel the weight of whispered conversations and purposeful glances exchanged between vendors and customers. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of these economic boycotts in hastening colonial withdrawal, but one thing is clear: they were a form of nonviolent leverage that challenged French control without the need for arms. The peaceful marches that sometimes accompany these boycotts swell in numbers, often led by respected community elders, women's groups, and youth activists, all united in a dignified demand for respect and rights. These gatherings walk a fine line, maintaining order and calm while projecting an unmistakable strength of purpose. It's a scene reminiscent of the famous marches you might have heard about from other parts of the world, only here it's set against the unique backdrop of Benin's vibrant cultural mosaic. And here's a fun detail: during one such boycott, local tailors cleverly replaced buttons on clothing with tiny carvings of the baobab tree, a silent symbol of endurance and deep roots, signaling solidarity without a word spoken. The French officials focused on more obvious signs of rebellion, often missed these subtle cues, highlighting how culture and creativity were intertwined with resistance. So as you stroll these lively streets, sensing the hum of community and quiet determination, remember that sometimes the most powerful protests are those where the crowd's footsteps and whispered signs say everything. You now feel the wind shifting, subtle but unmistakable, as the once mighty grip of France begins to falter under the persistent peaceful pressure of Benin's non-violent resistance. The world beyond Dahome's borders is changing rapidly. The post-World War II era brings new ideas about self-determination, and colonialism is increasingly challenged on the global stage. Back home, the relentless quiet strength of boycotts, petitions, and cultural defiance sends ripples that cannot be ignored. The French, long accustomed to unquestioned authority, start to waver as international opinion turns against colonialism, and the cost of maintaining their empire becomes ever heavier. You almost hear the murmurs in Parisian salons, diplomats' whispers at the United Nations, and in the corridors of French political power, Benin's voice, once muffled, grows louder and harder to silence. Historians still debate how much international pressure influenced France's decision to grant independence versus the relentless grassroots efforts within Benin itself. What stands out is the interplay between local determination and shifting global tides. It's fascinating to consider that while French politicians debated strategy in distant chambers, Beninese women and men held steady on the streets and in their homes, wielding non-violence as a weapon more potent than guns. This period saw the emergence of charismatic leaders who could channel the collective will, rallying citizens without resorting to force. They embodied a new kind of power, moral, cultural, and unyielding. A quirky footnote from this era: some French officials reportedly tried to deploy mime artists to pacify crowds, believing that silent performances might distract protesters. Unsurprisingly, this tactic failed spectacularly, and the mime troupe quickly found themselves outnumbered by peaceful marchers singing freedom songs. It's a humorous reminder that colonial powers often misunderstood the spirit of resistance they faced, mistaking creativity and community strength for chaos. So as the winds of change swirl around you, remember that sometimes the greatest power lies in unwavering calm and the refusal to be broken. You stand now at the edge of a monumental moment, the 1960 referendum, that will decide the fate of Dahomey, soon to be Benin, where the people's voices rise louder than ever before, but in a way that's still peaceful, deliberate, and full of promise. This referendum isn't a clash of armies or the thunder of protests. It's a quiet, weighty decision made with ballots, not bullets. You can almost feel the tension in the air as voters line up patiently at polling stations under the watchful eyes of observers and the hopeful glances of neighbors. Each vote cast is a tiny act of defiance and hope, a declaration that the future belongs to the people themselves. The process reflects a broader shift across Africa, where the wave of decolonization is rising and nations prepare to step out of the shadow of imperial rule. Historians still debate how free and fair these referendums truly were, considering the pressures and complexities of the time, but there's no doubt that this moment carried enormous symbolic weight. It was a peaceful assertion of sovereignty that challenged the notion that independence had to be won through violence. You might find it intriguing that despite the stakes, many campaigners used folk theatre and street performances to educate voters about the referendum, turning politics into a communal celebration rather than a grim battle. These events blended tradition with modern political engagement, showing how culture remained deeply intertwined with the pursuit of freedom. And here's a little-known fact: in some rural areas where official ballots were scarce, people used pebbles and seeds to cast votes in informal but widely respected community counts. This quirky improvisation highlights the ingenuity and determination of people eager to participate, no matter the obstacles. So, as you picture those long lines and earnest faces, remember that in this quiet act of voting, the seeds of a new nation were sown with hope, patience, and peaceful resolve.
Yeah.
You awaken now to the early morning of August 1st, 1960, when the sun rises over a land finally free, and Benin's flag flutters proudly where once the French tricolour had dominated the sky. The air is thick with celebration and a mix of relief, joy, and cautious optimism. Streets that had once murmured with secret songs and quiet protests now pulse with the sounds of drums, laughter, and speeches. You can almost feel the warm dust beneath your feet as people from all walks of life gather: farmers, students, artisans, elders, sharing smiles and stories under the banner of newfound freedom. This dawn is not just the end of colonial rule, but the beginning of a fresh, collective journey. The nonviolent struggle that shaped this moment hums softly in the background, a testament to the power of patience, unity, and peaceful resistance. Historians still debate the extent to which this independence was a result of internal movements versus international pressure. But what remains unquestioned is the dignity with which the people of Benin claimed their place among nations. The leaders who stepped forward were often those who had nurtured resistance in classrooms, markets, and churches, embodying the spirit of peaceful struggle. Interestingly, despite the celebrations, there was no grand military parade or show of force, just the quiet pride of a people who had won their freedom without shedding blood in the streets. This peaceful transition marked Benin as a hopeful example in a continent where independence sometimes came with harsh conflict. Here's a charming detail. During the independence ceremony, a local child famously released a handful of butterflies, symbolizing transformation and hope. The butterflies, unpredictable and free, fluttered above the crowd as if nature itself was celebrating the birth of a nation. So as you imagine that bright morning surrounded by color music and the gentle hum of possibility, remember that freedom is often sweetest when earned without violence, carried forward on the wings of peaceful courage. You now step cautiously into the fragile early years of Benin's independence, a time when hope shines bright, but shadows of challenge linger close behind. The dream of freedom is fresh, vibrant, and undeniably powerful, yet the path forward is far from smooth. The new government faces the daunting task of uniting diverse ethnic groups, building institutions from the ground up, and steering a young nation through economic uncertainty and political tensions. You can almost hear the whispered conversations in homes and offices, the blend of excitement and worry that comes with the weight of responsibility. Independence was won peacefully, but maintaining that peace and turning dreams into reality demands constant care and courage. Historians still argue whether the early struggles in governance and social cohesion were inevitable or exacerbated by lingering colonial structures. But the fact remains that Benin's leaders had to navigate uncharted waters with limited resources and experience. The citizens too had to redefine their identities in a landscape no longer defined by colonial borders, but by the hope for shared progress. Remarkably, the spirit of nonviolent resistance that had carried them this far continued to influence political discourse and civil society, reminding everyone that dialogue and inclusion were vital. It's telling that many grassroots organizations born during the struggle played crucial roles in community development and national dialogue. On a lighter note, one of the early presidents was known for his fondness for a traditional dish called pate, made from cornmeal and often served with spicy sauces, so much so that state dinners sometimes humorously turned into celebrations of local cuisine, a subtle nod to reclaiming culture. It's these human moments amid serious challenges that reveal the resilience and warmth of a nation finding its footing. So as the sun sets on this chapter of Benin's story, you realize that independence is not a destination but a journey, one paved with persistence, patience, and the peaceful strength of a people who dared to dream. Tonight, as you nestle deeper into your cozy spot, feel the soft fading of daylight as it gently ushers you toward rest. The story of Benin's journey, a tale woven with patience. Spirit and quiet courage lingers like a comforting melody, its rhythm slow and steady like your own breathing. Remember the ancestral drums and whispered prayers, the marketplace's hum, transformed into a chorus of peaceful determination. Freedom came softly, like dawn breaking through the night, carrying promises wrapped in resilience and hope. Let your thoughts drift with the butterflies released on that bright morning of independence, fluttering freely in the warm breeze, reminding you that transformation is both gentle and unstoppable. The challenges that lie ahead for Benin mirror our own journeys, full of unknowns but anchored in the strength of community and the power of peaceful action. Feel the steady pulse of that enduring spirit, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage and kindness build the foundation of lasting freedom. Now, as the world quiets and your eyelids grow heavy, allow yourself to rest in the calm certainty that every struggle holds the seed of renewal. the story fades softly into the night, a lullaby whispered across time, inviting you to dream of lands where hope endures and peaceful courage lights the way. Sweet dreams,